In a world where there's already many amazing runs for Daredevil, it's difficult for anybody writing to stand apart from the crowd. But can Charles Soule manage to do it? Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Charles Soule and illustrated by a handful of artists, including Ron Garney and Phil Noto. The first issue with this Daredevil run was published by Marvel Comics in December of 2015, with Soule leaving the title at issue 612 in December of 2018. And Daredevil's back in New York City. With the world forgetting that he's Daredevil and back practicing law in the DA's office, he just wants to keep a low profile. But when a young, invisible vigilante called Blindspot appears on the scene, he'll be roped into taking down a crime syndicate that's led by the mystical Tenfingers. And this sets off a chain of events that puts him in the crosshairs of pretty much every member of his rogues gallery. And yes, that includes Stiltman. But with these two lives conflicting each other at every turn, can Matt Murdock find a way to make them work together? Or is he just destined to face an eternal battle on both sides of the law? This is a book of real highs and just bizarre lows when it comes to the art. Ron Garney kicks off the book and I loved this. The muted colours, flat 2D look and minimal lines was just amazing to see. And it's funny because some of the later art that I wasn't too keen on could be described in the same way, but Garney just found a way to make it work. He made it feel intentional rather than later on when it felt rushed, probably just to meet a deadline. The only downside to Garney is that he takes a few issues off, and when he comes back it just feels like he doesn't have that same pizzazz, which is one of my favourite words, that made his style so great in the beginning. There's also other artists that fill in, and it feels like they just try to replicate what he did, especially if you look at the Elektra issues, so it does get a bit confusing if you're not repeatedly jumping back to the table of contents. And I've noticed this about a few Marvel Now titles, that the interesting loop that really gets me invested just doesn't seem to exist later on. It's quite an interesting balance because I noticed that the art tended to pick up if the story wasn't really at its peak, but at the same time the art tended to be lacking when the story was really hitting its stride. So artistically the lower points come in the second half of the book and the main offender is only there for a few issues, but it looks like just an outline. It looked like they did the absolute bare minimum to get this pushed and published. In these issues I found myself focusing on the art and wondering exactly what was going on, maybe what the story was behind the scenes, rather than the plot, which is a shame because this was when it was at its most interesting. Phil Noto carries this book to its conclusion and I really liked his style. It was more realistic and clean, although there are some scenes where he uses a more watercolour look, and I think it looks great, but it just doesn't really feel like a Daredevil book. Regardless, I like the way that this guy carried the story forward, and after Garney, he's probably the most dynamic and experimental with his layouts. And he just had this great energy with his illustration, and pain seemed to be less comedic and more focused in on. Like, don't get me wrong, I never wanted to be hit by one of Daredevil's billy clubs, but I'm gonna spend the rest of my life actively avoiding it now. And I've said this before with runs that have multiple artists, but it's difficult to find a consistent praise or criticism because the styles don't always match what came before or after. It often gave a lot of different vibes that matched the storyline that it was telling because it could often go from mysticism to realistic, and it felt like some artists were trying to replicate Garney, some were trying to replicate Chris Somney, and then you just had this great Punisher miniseries that had a more realistic look to it. I guess if I'm to summarise my feelings on the art, it's overall decent, but it peaks at the very beginning and it doesn't hit the same highs throughout. It does get a second wind in the final arc, but to the detriment of the overall tone. However, there's such a variety of styles that there must be at least one in here that you would enjoy, but if there is one artist, then don't get too attached to them. But the odds are, if I open this book up on a random page, it'd probably be one that I enjoyed. And you can test that out for yourself by picking this book up or any others from the channel's sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below and you can use these codes as many times as you like. This story opens with an arc about Tenfingers, which is also the nickname of someone that I knew in high school, and highlighted one of the things that I enjoyed most about Soule's Darth Vader run, that he can create his own characters and keep you engaged enough that you don't miss the bigger names. Although don't worry, with the size of this omnibus they're pretty much guaranteed to appear at some point, and this was a pretty interesting storyline, but all the while it felt like Soule was just getting warmed up. I'm not afraid to admit that I wasn't massively in love with this run right out of the gate, but it might have been because my expectations were just so high. And I know that isn't really fair to put onto this book, but when it comes to Daredevil I just can't really help that. And even though I did enjoy Tenfingers, there was a lot about him that just reminded me of the Mandarin, so it's kind of a bit of a double-edged sword. I do give him respect for creating a character and going out of his way to try and set the tone a bit different. But at the same time, if your character reminds me of someone else within this same universe, then naturally I'm going to compare them. But I did like that this incorporated the mysticism in it well, and it also introduced the hand without making it feel ham-fisted or that they weren't really a threat that needed to be there, which is something that happened later on in this book. So if you're a massive fan of the hand, make sure you enjoy this story arc whilst it lasts. And it's clear that it's still lingering unresolved threads from the Mark fucking Waid era. If I'm remembering right, I didn't include this run in my Where to Start Daredevil, and that is something that I'd still agree with, because it does require some prior knowledge, even though it does try to catch up quite well, and it also explains it later on in the book. But don't hold yourself back if you haven't read the Waid stuff, although that is something that I would definitely recommend. Early on there's an enjoyable Elektra story, but it felt like it was on the cusp of being something great, and then it was just cut short again. There's a fight scene between her and Daredevil because of course if you're two heroes and you see each other, you're gonna have to fight. And I thought this was where the book was really gonna start gaining some momentum. But honestly, I had to check that this wasn't a crossover with some other kind of series, because it felt like Elektra was on her own mission, that something had started before this book and that was going to continue after it. And this isn't her only appearance in this omnibus, but I really enjoyed the storyline that they kind of teased with this. I won't say too much, but they could have gone further and used it as a springboard to explore the deeper parts of her and Daredevil's relationship. Blindspot was a new character that was created for this run, and I didn't know what his purpose would be, but I kept an open mind. As bad and gatekeeper-esque as it might sound, I think the Marvel Universe has so many interesting characters already that you have to have a real good reason to create a new one. Otherwise, just pick from the plethora of characters that have been forgotten throughout the years. But I had faith in Charles Soule, and I'm glad that I did. Sam was fun, interesting and pivotal during the opening arc with Tenfingers, and his storyline with his mother and also his immigration status made him interesting beyond just him being a vigilante. But it's just a shame because after those initial story arcs, it feels like he's just there as a plot convenience. They did give him a bigger role during the Muse storyline, but at this point, his and Daredevil's past had just diverged so much that I wasn't really that invested in Sam anymore. So it felt like it was taking time from the storyline that I wanted to be involved with to give some air to this character that you'd completely forgotten about. I can't even remember the last thing that Sam did in this run, which is a shame because he started off so great. And it also reminded me of one of the problems that I had with Soule's Darth Vader run when I reviewed that, and that it felt like it didn't have a point from the very beginning. But one thing that this omnibus did great throughout is balancing Matt being Daredevil along with him being a lawyer. Whereas there has been a handful of occasions on the past where it felt like that was just his job, that he needs to keep up appearances, this book showed that he likes being on that side of the law and that he wants to use the judicial process as best as he can. His most interesting conflict comes from him being on both sides of the law, and this book tried to take it one step further by making them one and the same. I loved all the law stuff, and it did something that made me enjoy Bendis' run so much every time I've read it. When I care about the non-Daredevil stuff as much as I care about the Daredevil stuff, you are doing something right. So despite some of the other criticisms that I've had about this book, if you do enjoy the law part of Daredevil, then this is definitely the run for you. But in saying that, I noticed that the religious aspect of Matt Murdock wasn't really a major factor. So it's like it gives with one hand but takes away with the other. And sure, the Catholicism is scattered throughout, but it isn't really ever the focal point. They try and tie it in the last story arc, and I'll probably speak about that in the spoiler section, but if you're somebody who likes that aspect of Daredevil, then you might be better off reading one of the earlier runs. We then get another 2-issue arc that they try to tie into the overall plot, but if I'm being honest with you, I get the feeling that Soule just really wanted to show Matt Murdock at a poker game, and was just like, I don't care how I get this into the series, but it's going in. The whole storyline was like Casino Royale, especially because Matt was doing some espionage type stuff in the background, and it reminded me a lot of what I saw in Black Widow by the man himself, Mark fucking Waid. And speaking of which, these are those issues that really reminded me of his run. The art does definitely remind me a lot of Chris Samnee, but I just think the quirky nature of the overall story was really reminiscent of what had come before. So tonally it was a little bit confusing because we'd had a bit of a darker storyline before this with Tenfingers, and then all of a sudden he's on some international mission to get this briefcase. There was also a nice appearance from a big character within the Marvel Universe, and at first I thought it wasn't really going to make too much sense, but it was executed in a way that felt necessary to the story, even if I do still believe that this was only done so that they could put him on the cover and hopefully sell a few more issues. And at the end of the day, if that's the way you're going to make your bread, I'm good with that. But in particular, I like that they just allowed this to be its own thing. Yeah, they did try to connect it loosely, but at the same time, you probably could have just jumped on at these 2 issues. And it's stuff like this and the Elektra storyline that came before it that gave me the sense that they were onto great things, but they just never had the time to flesh it out. But before that can ever really take off, we're introduced into a storyline with a villain called Muse. He was intriguing, unsettling, and I just never really figured out what his deal was. But unfortunately, this arc felt way longer than it needed to be. And there was also just a lot of back and forth with other minor characters that I felt they could have got rid of, and it would have really helped the pace. And it just felt like there was a lot of meandering meandering in this longer story arc, and I was getting heavy flashbacks to the Burning Seas arc that was in the Darth Vader run, because it started as if it was going to go down this detective mystery type story, which I was fully on board for, but it abandoned that pretty quickly, and it's just fortunate that Muse was engaging enough to keep me invested in this story arc, after the stuff with the art and the legality side of it was ditched off. The miniseries with the Punisher was also a great time and a real highlight for this omnibus. Even though it's written by Charles Soule, it isn't fundamental to the overall book, so I am just glad that they included it. The plot is simple and a bit Terminator-esque in its execution, which is probably the reason why I enjoyed it so much, but Soule really gave us the relentless Frank Castle, to the point where I wish he could do his own series. He gave us the guy that would just bulldoze through anything to reach his target. There was also some great stuff with the Crimson Dynamo, and it was just really fun start to finish, to the point where I could just come back and read just these couple of issues. Matt Murdock also has a new costume in this, which I liked quite a bit at the beginning. I do think it overstayed its welcome. I am a bit biased because I just love the mainline costume so much, and I wish that would have been brought back in a lot sooner. Funnily enough, it felt like the book itself knew that it'd gone on for too long, and it just kind of shoehorned out the new costume and brought the old one back in without even really giving it a great explanation. Not gonna lie, we don't need a great explanation. The guy's blind, he could just say they picked out the wrong suit that day, and I would have been fine with that, but I don't think that the new costume served much more of a purpose than to just give it a new look. But then again, it does look cool. But this is coming from a guy who likes armoured Daredevil. I liked Foggy in this run as well. He's always a bit hit and miss for me, but I do appreciate that he's a key component to Matt Murdock's life, and Soule did a great job of illustrating why Matt needs him and how his life is categorically worse when he's not there. He is still a bit whiny and annoying, which I do get as an ironic criticism coming from me, but this was a storyline that I felt really had a beginning, a middle, and an end that stretched throughout the entire book, rather than it just being a thing for a couple of issues and then completely forgotten about. And I guess that was the real strength of this book, and what I enjoyed most about it is that the Daredevil stuff was interesting for the most part, but I really liked the Matt Murdock stuff more. In saying that though, there was one story arc that revolved around the Purple Man, and I did not enjoy this. It's effectively the prequel to this run, and it is cleaning up some of the messier parts about the end of Wade's run. But the thing is, I didn't really need this. We'd already seen that there was tension between Matt and Foggy and been given enough information to figure out why. And you've already established that everybody's forgotten that Matt Murdock's Daredevil. But by this point in the omnibus, there was already a few storylines that were ongoing, to the point where I didn't care as much about those questions that I might have had at the beginning. So it is just a bit confusing about where this is placed, because I get the feeling that Soule didn't really need to do this, but maybe somebody behind the scenes told him that he had to. But there isn't really any kind of revelation here that ties into the story that's ongoing, and it ended in a place that we'd already moved on from. It'd be like if in this video I all of a sudden start talking about all the things that I missed out in my Green Arrow review. And yes, there was a pretty interesting sense of dramatic irony, but at the same time, if it would have meant that we got rid of these couple of issues, I'd have been fine just not seeing that. Now this might seem like a minor nitpick, but I noticed it throughout the entire book. And there's one characteristic about Matt Murdock that kind of separates him from a lot of other heroes. Nope, not the fact that he's deeply religious. No, not the fact that near enough every woman that he loves dies. And I am not talking about him being a lawyer. And if you didn't know it going into this book, by the end you will definitely remember that Matt Murdock is blind. Like, it's something that pretty much everybody knows. It's like knowing that Bruce Wayne's parents are dead. Spoilers if you didn't know. Or that Krypton blew up. Again, sorry, spoilers. But to me, it got to the point where I felt like this book was just kind of being mean. Like, even Matt himself keeps getting in on the action and just ripping into him because of the fact that he's got no sight. Like, at the halfway point of this book, probably when he got his costume back, they probably should have just done him a favour and changed his name to something like Blind Man McGee. And one thing that I noticed with other Marvel Now books is that they ramped up the cameos all the way to 11. It was very noticeable when I reviewed All New Wolverine, but Daredevil has a bit more balance. Near enough every character that features in this book feels important to the plot, and not just that they're there so that they can put them on the cover, even though I kind of said exactly that earlier on when I was talking about the casino arc. And for me, it just made the cameos more enjoyable and surprising when they actually happened. And I try not to get involved in any kind of political discussion, mostly because of the fact that I'm too stupid to really comprehend what I'm saying, but a lot of it in this book did feel on the nose. So sometimes a very natural conversation between Daredevil and Blindspot would all of a sudden just shoehorn the fact that he's an illegal immigrant. Or the political storyline towards the end seemed to draw heavy comparisons to what was happening with Trump. As a Brit, I'm not really going to comment too much more on it, but if that's the kind of thing that you don't really like, then maybe this isn't going to be the run for you. Because there were some instances where it pulled me out of the story, and I'm not even really involved with any kind of American politics. Speaking of which, Kingpin was waiting in the wings throughout this entire omnibus, and when he finally appeared and made his motives known, this book really hit its crescendo. I absolutely loved what they did with this character, even if it does feel like they took some inspiration from Lex Luthor. And when you're bringing Kingpin into your Daredevil run, you must know know that there's going to be a lot of pressure on that. This is when everybody knows that you're going to try and do the most with your story, and it feels like Soule lived up to that expectation. But the shame is that the conclusion of it felt really rushed, and in a way that kind of goes against the character of Wilson Fisk. But still, this arc was the peak of the story, and I can't really say too much more without jumping into spoilers. This is your final spoiler warning, so if you don't want anything ruined, I'd recommend skipping to the final verdict timestamp down below. But picking up where I left off, it wasn't really a surprise to me to see Wilson go into the role of mayor, but him wanting Matt as his deputy, just damn. When I read that, I felt the tone shift and I was really excited and also not really clued up on where this could go. I did admittedly think it was a bit quick of Matt to just decide, yes, I'll take up this role, and didn't really seem to think it through. But at the same time, it didn't really matter because I thought this was going to be positioned in a similar way to Superman and Lex, and it was just going to be that Matt had a greater struggle to go up against, but instead we got to see him work alongside his mortal enemy. And I can't lie, it delivered. The dynamic between the two, the microaggressions, Matt trying to figure out what the bigger picture was, to me made this one of the most entertaining Daredevil arcs. And the best part about it was that it didn't prevent there being engaging battles between Fisk and Daredevil, especially the one where he was trying to deliberately goad him into hurting him. I think that was the best one in this book. The disappointing thing with it is that the Hand got forced into the story, and it also felt like this overall just got sidetracked for Mike Murdock. The Hand, at least in my opinion, are one of the least interesting antagonists for Matt to go up against. Sure, yes, a faceless group is intimidating, and them having the fingers in so many different things throughout the city does make it a complex plot, but in this omnibus it felt like they were reintroduced to just remove Fisk from the storyline for a bit. So I did enjoy Fisk in this book, and I like that he wasn't there from the very beginning. It felt like they were really building up to it, and that it was actually a rewarding payoff when he did appear, because there are a lot of books that tend to use the biggest hitter straight away and then they can never really reach that same standard. But they could have developed the conclusion so that there was more than just one conversation that brought about his downfall. Fisk, as we know, is arrogant and egotistical, but he's not stupid, and I feel like this was a completely out of left field turn for the character. And it also felt like they assembled all these heroes for pretty much nothing if it was that he was going to be his own downfall. Mike Murdock, the guy who filled the space whilst Fisk was out of commission, even though that is a massive hole that somebody would have to fill. The mystery around his existence was fun, and I like seeing him in the supervillain bar, but I hated the explanation and the fact that he was a tangible being. It was also very Scooby-Doo-esque, and the fact that the Vigil was introduced at the same time, but what I did enjoy was how conflicted Matt was about his presence and the moral argument that was built around if he can remove him. And I think if this storyline would have been earlier on in the book and not during the Wilson Fisk part, I probably would have enjoyed it more, but unfortunately for me it did just feel a little bit shoehorned in and a little bit too late. Now I'm biased, but I wish that Elektra had been in this book more. The issues that we did have with her were great, and I like the storyline that she thought her baby was missing, but then it turned out to be a manipulation tactic which I didn't really enjoy. It felt like a bit of a cop-out. It would have been interesting if she had a kid and it turned out to be Matt, and then you've got this situation where they are forced to be together in some way. She did come back later on. I loved their relationship and the fact that they knew that they could never really be together, and I think that was something that was handled well in this book. I just wish I could have seen more of it. And although I did enjoy the Fisk storyline the most, I really liked the one where Daredevil was trying to become part of the judicial process, and this debate about how it would have affected vigilantism overall. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's the right word. And in a post-Civil War Marvel universe, this argument made a lot of sense. Sure, yes, it was a bit hokey how they excused Matt being in the courtroom, and everybody just didn't bat an eyelid about that, but then again, if you didn't remember from the book itself, Matt Murdock's blind, and I'll just forgive it because it gave us a really interesting storyline. This also helped Foggy and Matt move past their issues, which is something that I really liked. I love seeing that development between the two, and it felt like at this point the book understood what it could do to really separate it from other runs. Had it continued on that line and not really peter out when Wilson Fisk appeared again, then it probably could have been one of the best storylines. But in saying that, it did come back at the end, and it was the reason why all the superheroes could testify against Fisk, so it does get redeemed a little bit. But in all honesty, I like this concept so much that I would have been comfortable if this was some kind of mini event across a load of different titles. Kind of like Civil War, but a little bit more, well, civil. Now at the very end of this book, I'm talking the last couple of pages of the last issue, they're just odd. They built up to it, they called this entire storyline the death of Daredevil, and it felt like they were going for a really monumental scene. But despite that, it just felt like it hadn't really put in the legwork to earn this moment and to have it be a big thing. The fight with Vigil was really fun, and there was a lot of action in this issue that really made it interesting to read and really go out in a bang. But what was the point in the fake out death? It just felt like it all meant nothing. Is the message that Matt can now choose when he dies? And I think this omnibus would have capped off fine if it just focused on everything else that was already ongoing, and because both of those storylines felt quite forced, they could have saved a couple of pages by removing all this Matt dying stuff and just giving those plots that I already cared about and I was already invested in for quite a couple of issues a less forced ending. This is my final verdict. and I imagine it's both a blessing and a curse when you're writing Daredevil. When it comes to the Man Without Fear, there's probably not another superhero in the last 25 years that's had such a consistently high level of quality. From Smith to Quesada to Bendis to Brubaker to Diggle, for the most part, Mark fucking Waid, Charles Soule and Chip Zdarsky currently, and that's without taking into account what Miller did back in the 80s. But at the same time, with such a consistently high level of expectation and delivery, a story that might be great for another hero might not live up to the same standard for Daredevil, and that's the dichotomy that Charles Soule faces in this omnibus. This is a run that has some great highs within it and really pushes the boundary for both Matt Murdock and Daredevil, which, yes, I'm aware are the same person, in a way that feels fresh yet natural and organic. The stuff that happens in this book feels like the next logical step for this character, but in a world where there's already so many great stories for Daredevil, Soule's run unfortunately doesn't do enough to make it stand apart from the crowd. But if I'm being honest, it's still a solid crowd to just be amongst. I did have a good time with this book, but I often found myself thinking that it could have done a bit more, and that there were already other Daredevil runs that I'd read that were better than this, and there were many moments of greatness that just weren't capitalised on and were often cut too short before they could fully develop. I do, however, think it's still worth investing for any fan of Daredevil, and you're definitely not wasting your time by reading this, as it did keep me engaged. There were some real highlights with the art, and it pulled from a wide range of Daredevil characters to make me want to continue reading this. But unfortunately, as a lifetime Daredevil fan, I can't say that this is the go-to run that everybody needs to pick up, and admittedly that was a very difficult mountain to climb before I even read issue 1. This might seem like a harsh score that I'll come back to regret, but when I look at this run overall, I have to give it a very modest score of 65%. Woof woof. So that's my review. If you've checked this out, let me know what you think in the comments section below, or join us over on a Reddit page. But until next time, just make sure that you stay safe and stay mad, all you dogs. Woof woof. See you in the next video.